Good evening, everyone. We're going to call this meeting to order December 4th at 6 p.m. Before we get going, I'd just like to recognize that tonight's meeting is being held on the traditional and unceded territories of the Sunnimu people. I'm seeking if there are any additions, deletions, or changes to order of the agenda. Seeing none, I'll seek a motion to approve the agenda. From Trustee Higginson, seconded by Trustee Keller. All those in favor? I got two people in favor of that. All those in favor? Alrighty, thanks. Any opposed? Okay, seeing none opposed, we'll approve the agenda. Seeking a motion to approve the minutes of November 6th of the Education Committee. Someone like to propose that motion? Trustee Higginson. Seconded by Trustee Barron. All those in favor? Unanimous. Alrighty. Trustee O'Neill is abstaining because she was absent for that. So thank you for that. Okay, moving on to senior staff reports. We have a presentation from Assistant Superintendent Laura Tate and Assistant Superintendent Don Balcombe. Invite you up to the front here.
Yep. All right. Good evening. Welcome. This is our great pleasure to present to you again on the Education Committee. We have, as we laid out with our plan in past, to cover the four broad goals from an overview for the trustees, and then in January, February, March, April, May, June, present some school groups for you, digging deeper into some of those goals individually, and then overlapping on them as well. So our goal for this evening is to share with you a little bit around our inclusive and diversity goal, as well as our goal around truth and reconciliation. So we have our four broad goals. Last month we presented around continuous improvement of instruction and assessment and our leadership around environmental sustainability and stewardship. And each of our presentations that we have coming up for you in January through to June, we're going to be asking schools to look at some of the core values that the board has identified and kind of pull out which ones speak to them the most for the presentation. So for these two goals, obviously, we've gone from two goals that were quite cerebral around instruction and assessment and sustainability, and now we're going a little bit deeper into the heart around inclusive education and truth and reconciliation. So obviously, student-centered value jumps out big time for us, as well as inclusion, diversity, and equity. So those are the values that, as we were putting it together, said these are the ones that we like to highlight. We're bringing these two board goals kind of forward for us to have a conversation this evening. And unlike last time where we had them on separate slides, we kind of said this is instruction and assessment, and then we'll deal with environmental stewardship and sustainability separately. Laura and I started preparing this. We started realizing that safe, caring, inclusive environments, being respectful of diversity and truth and reconciliation go hand in hand. And really, when we're doing one, we're doing the other, and it kind of went back and forth. So this presentation is a little bit more interconnected, but that's kind of our goal going forward. As we mentioned, we're hoping as you get into the April, May, June presentations, all of those board goals are going to be in that sweet spot where you won't be able to tell which goals are being addressed in the presentation because it's all happening at once. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the current and ongoing efforts to support and improve inclusion and diversity. I'm just going to share with you a little bit of my experience in inclusive education when we talk about special education. And I had the honor of having a presentation from Bruce Barstow last year. He's a retired superintendent who's done lots of work around special education and inclusion. And a couple things stuck out for me from his presentation. One is he said, you usually don't know whether our efforts to make improvements in education are actually taking root until we look back about 10 years. So you go forward 10 years and then you look back and say, are we further along than where we were 10 years ago? So it takes about 10 years before you kind of look back. And the example that he shared around inclusive education and meeting the unique needs of learners is you go back to the 60s and 70s, where the model of supporting learners with special needs was they were excluded from our mainstream programming, and we had them in separate physical buildings. All of the programming and everything happened out of sight, out of mind of our other educational programs. And at the time, that was what was deemed best efforts. And then from that, fast forward as you go through the decades, they realized, let's bring students with unique needs into the building. They made it into the building, but down the hallway into a separate room. Well, looking back 10 years in the past, it's better than being excluded. It's in the building. And then it was like, in the building's not good enough. So those students with unique special needs started to get mainstreamed into the regular programming. So they're physically in the space, but not necessarily having a meaningful experience with their peers and interacting in their own education. Looking back 10 years, it's better than being down the hallway in a room. So it was progress, but it wasn't where we wanted to be. And so now we're into a model where students are integrated, fully integrated into the regular programming, and they're having meaningful and valuable experiences. And that's the best efforts now. And now we're looking forward, saying, where can we go next to make those experiences better?
And as a parallel example, we could think about residential schools, where our First Nations Indigenous children were segregated off in separate areas. And as we look at how time moved over time, we eventually integrated those children, like myself, into our regular schools. But our Aboriginal education support was often segregated and pulled out. And as we work toward more and more toward collective ownership and understanding diversity and equity, we are trying to get on with both of these topics to this same place of that sense of belonging, those safe, caring, and inclusive environments.
Discomfort and uncertainty. And it's a good discomfort to be in, because we're realizing that to move forward, we have to acknowledge that there are some structural barriers within our system. We have a system that is a colonial model system that's been tweaked around the edges to be fairly efficient and works really well for a certain number of students. And to change that, to say, how do we meet the needs of our students when we look at our graduation rates for our Indigenous learners and for our students with unique special needs, there's a huge area for growth still. So to do that differently, we have to be willing to disrupt the system and change some of that practice that's really comfortable for people in the system who've been there. They're like, this really works for me as an adult, and it works for many of my students. And when we're saying yes, and we want it to work for more students, it has to be uncomfortable. It can't be, great, I feel just as good next year as I did this year. So there's a bit of discomfort in the system and anxiety in the system, but it's a positive, it's a healthy anxiety, a healthy tension.
And the healthy tension, anxiety, or disruption, if you will, moving into action, can't come until we've really acknowledged and mucked about with our beliefs and our values around all of these topics. When we talk about change and we think about making change, that often comes down to the core root of who we are as people. And where do we get our beliefs and values? We get those from people who love us and who we love. And so when we think about change, we're not just talking about changing our clothes or changing our hairdo. We are talking about something that generation after generation, we've built these beliefs and values into us as individuals, as families, as societies, and communities. And so when we talk about, getting uncomfortable or this discomfort or this healthy anxiety, I just really want to just have us pause just to really recognize how deep and sort of still surmountable, but how deep we are needing to go around these topics.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, we encourage you to go on a little journey with us back in time for you to imagine a time. So I want you to think a little bit about your own experiences. And if closing your eyes helps through this experience, feel free to close your eyes. But I want you to go back and imagine a time where you did not belong. Who you were, what you're all about was not really acknowledged, not honored, definitely not celebrated. There was some discomfort. You knew you didn't belong. You weren't trespassing. You legally were allowed to be in this place, but you really had that sense like, this is not my place. So just think of that time. We all have those moments in our past where you had those experiences like, this is not the place for me. I don't feel like I'm welcome. This doesn't feel good. And I want you to think, where was it? What was a physical space like? Who was there? What was happening at that time? How are you interacting or not interacting in that environment with those people? What was being said? What did you hear? What were the sensations? What were the feelings you were experiencing that made you think, that made you know that that wasn't the right place for you, that you didn't have that sense of connectedness and belonging? What was that all about? When you've taken yourself back to that place of discomfort and anxiety, and probably there's a bit of dread in there, you should just imagine that you're one of the learners or one of our families in NLPS right now who's having that same feeling when they go to school, or when they go to some part of the school, or when they're asked to come to a function that involves the school district. And we have lots of students and lots of families that are in that place of discomfort. And just like you in your experience, maybe nobody was doing anything overtly to make you not feel welcome, but you felt it. You sensed it. Chances are physically you're probably closer to a wall. You're excluded from somebody. If there was an ally in that room full of people that you didn't feel like you really connected with, you got closer to that person because you're like, you're my support. Definitely we're not in a place of open learning. Bring it on. Put me into a vulnerable learning place and help me grow. You're in survival mode and defense mode. And with that in mind, we want to share with you how we're trying to address those things and move us to a better place. So we've organized our things that we're going to share with you around our safe, caring, inclusive environment and our truth and reconciliation into three kind of areas. The first area are systems, structures, and people of influence. So at the district level, we have lots of structures that we've put in place to work on our inclusion and diversity and our truth and reconciliation. We have staff that are dedicated towards that. And we have and they have influences within the system. So we're just going to go through each of those individually and share a little bit with you. And if you have questions, if you're not sure what we're talking about, this is the great time to pause and say, who are these people and what's the role, or who's this group of people?
And always as a reminder that we are giving you a very high level, quick snapshot. Imagine this times probably 100 as to what all of the initiatives and activities that are going on in the district. So as you're well aware, we have a beautifully strong Indigenous education department, and we have had in the province, in our district, for many, many years, for decades. And so that is a very strong structure that we have to support inclusion and truth and reconciliation. You've allowed us to create a position, the manager of truth and reconciliation, that is probably unique in the province. And in that role, beautiful work is being done to support the adults in the system around truth and reconciliation. We, of course, have directors of inclusive education, at both the elementary and secondary level, that we work with very closely, but as a constant driver in steering us always to be mindful. And we have a team of learning coordinators that spend every waking moment trying to prepare and to collect learning opportunities for staff and educators around the system on these topics. And lastly, we have a unique group of Hul'qumi'num language teachers. Again, one of the strongest teams in the province, with our leader, of course, our Director of Instruction of Indigenous Education, is holding out and heralding a huge sign for this one as he moves forward around the Hul'qumi'num language.
Hello. So those are the people that are influencing the system. Our team of people that are dedicated towards these two board goals. And so we're just going to share with you a little bit around the opportunities that those people and those teams of people have to influence the system and move the agenda forward. So we have our district inclusion gatherings, if you want to.
Right, and I just want to acknowledge my colleague, Carrie Steele, who walks in with her perfect timing, one of our directors of inclusive education. And Carrie and I are hosting a series at the elementary level where we are addressing and building capacity with every school. We've got representation from every school, talking about all of those things from our beliefs and our values around inclusion, diversity, privilege, all of those topics that are making many of us uncomfortable, all the way as we work throughout the year, getting right down into the classroom and thinking about universally designing our learning environments and differentiating our instruction. Principals have been assigned to scan. They've got a beautiful rubric of inclusive practices at Tier 1, and they're going away for 2 months to scan their schools to find examples of inclusive practices in their schools. So it's an opportunity for us as a district to come together to really understand this term, because I think there's not probably any group of us that has the same definition of inclusion. And I think as a district, as a district goal, we need to come to terms and build collective understanding around all of these things so we can sort of all move in the same canoe.
Mm-hmm. We have our Meet and Eat series that happen throughout the year, and this is a great opportunity. Often when teachers are looking for learning opportunities at the Meet and Eats, often their requests are around how to be more inclusive, how to do that universal design for learning, and a lot of things around Aboriginal ways of knowing and understanding, First Peoples principles of learning, trying to uncover some of the gems that are in the curriculum and make that happen. We have our next session coming up is January 16th, and the focus for that is the CIATSIS framework and helping people have a better understanding of that. So we have a team of our district staff as well as our learning coordinators who are in the planning stages for that. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful learning opportunity for teachers for that, and those happen throughout the year.
Yeah, and any of these pro-learning opportunities like Meet and Eat or Brain Camp in the summer, not only as Don's saying, that we have that content address, but they're also, our team of leaders are also trying to implement and facilitate these learning opportunities whilst operating in an inclusive manner and operating through a lens of reconciliation. So they're modeling the behaviors and the strategies and the actions as they're delivering the content.
We have our professional learning communities time, so often schools have focused, this is a huge area of growth, and energy is put into these two goals around professional learning communities. So that's a K-12 system focus.
Most recently, the CIATSIS family and Nutsmut Tadalat, the CIATSIS family has asked and invited Nutsmut Tadalat to work together to define and to bring action to this policy of the CIATSIS policy.
Mm-hmm. I had a meeting yesterday. It was fabulous.
We've talked lots about focus goals. I've just wanted to mention and sort of express the notion that one of the key factors of focus goals is to bring parity to the Aboriginal student data. We'd like to see parity around all reading data with Aboriginal students. And although many schools are well into this practice and we're seeing quite a bit of the data change and increase and improve, the Focus Goals Initiative is another way to address reconciliation. Strong Start. We're working, just as a quick example, we're working with Strong Start facilitators to promote linguistically appropriate practice and cultural responsiveness with those small children and their families. And in many of our locations, it's a UN delegation in there, and it's a beautiful thing to see the languages and cultures brought into our Strong Start centers. Last year, we embarked on our student support scan, which I have previously mentioned. We're looking at all of the supports and how we provide supports in our schools. We've brought together focus groups. Carrie, I'll get you to jump in when you feel like adding anything in there. We've looked at ministry data, our own NLPS ministry data. We've had scan conversations with a certain number of pilot schools. We've surveyed through Thought Exchange every school around appreciatively looking at some of the practices that we have with regards to supporting students. We've done immense literature reviews, not only on student services, but also on inclusive education holistically. We were utilizing our own local collaborative inquiry cycle and our framework to dig in and to look at this process. And essentially, we haven't got to the point yet where we've got any conclusions and moving forward yet. We're still sort of in this process, but essentially we're looking at enhancing student support systems at the school level as well as looking at enhancing those systems at the district level. Carrie, do you want to add anything in there?
Just that it's been really affirming kind of having the dialogues with schools and talking with school teams where Laura and I don't know, it was referenced before I arrived. I apologize, I was coming from another appointment which delayed me, but having conversations and dialogue in the school, the stuff that we're seeing and we're excited about is happening in the schools. So being able to do an appreciative scan and surface some of the good work that's out there. And I think one of our really exciting projects coming out of this review is going to be how to help the school teams share with each other what they're up to, because there's pockets of really neat things happening all over the place. And some of them are things that could benefit other teams. So we need to find a way to kind of share all that good work. And it's a good way to get a crash course in the district in my first fall in the role too. So that's been just a personal piece that I really appreciated from the work so far.
Great. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
And at secondary level, same things happening around student support services scan and models, and there's common themes as schools are kind of reconfiguring how they provide support within the classroom to students as opposed to having students come out of the classroom experience for support. So it's a positive place. The whole response to intervention RTI tiered supports, there's lots of work happening around tier 1 supports for teachers in classrooms, as well as looking at ways to meet students' needs when they have a tier 2 or tier 3 need. So it's an ongoing experience.
With the goal, of course, with RTI is to really have healthy, robust practices at tier 1, because the more we can support that and build capacity around that, the more each child feels like their home place is inside that classroom, not elsewhere.
And the whole notion of universal design for learning is just that ability to say, if I take the student who has the greatest need around a learning opportunity, and I say, if I plan my design for that student who has the greatest needs, chances are all of my learners are going to benefit from that. So it's that concept of not starting in the middle, but starting and saying, what's the range of needs? How do I plan for all of the different types of needs in here? And if I plan for the extremes, the child who has the greatest need at this end and the child who has the greatest need at this end, you hit everybody in between. So that's a beautiful focus that's moving the whole province forward around that work. And then we have specific transitions. We focus on all of our transitions. So we have our early learning transition in, we have our grade 12 transition out. But the grade 7 to grade 8 transition is one area where this year we're putting a little bit of energy in with our learning coordinators on doing some best practices, figuring out how to make that transition the smoothest for students and families, because it's a big transition, natural transition period. And then we have our truth and reconciliation and inclusion and diversity in action. So kind of like, here's what it looks like if you walk into schools around the district. So you see a few examples that look like.
We have a day at the very beginning of the year due to gradual entry into kindergarten, where we pull all kindergarten teachers together and have a safe, caring, and inclusive kindergarten training. And from that, we've built kindergarten kits and now primary kits, all that with instruction and support, have all sorts of self-regulation and inclusive type activities and resources and tools inside.
The Northern Games is an activity that's been going on in the district for a number of years, and it's had a few schools involved. Last year, all of the secondary schools participated, and it's growing in leaps and bounds. It's a very positive experience. So you'll be invited to that. It's April 21st or 3rd is the district one.
We're supporting two-spirit identity teaching in all PHE classes from grades 4 to 10. We are also supporting anxiety education. We've subscribed to EASE training, where we've trained some district leaders, and they're beginning to roll that training out in schools.
The revised curriculum, just in and of itself, is a beautifully revised curriculum, and I think it's the envy of places all around the world when they see the BC curriculum. It has countless opportunities for students to engage in Indigenous ways of knowing, and also just a more inclusive approach to everything. It is a highlight. People from Alberta or Ontario or other parts of the world, when they look at our curriculum, they're amazed that the curriculum is so broad and open and allows teachers to do amazing work. It is so non-prescriptive, which is the word that you hear when you talk to teachers around the world with their curriculum. How do you find your curriculum? They find it restrictive and choking and prescriptive, right? And that's their main challenge. So the curriculum itself is a great example of how we can do things.
We are an inquiry passionate district, so we support, as a professional learning model, we support professional inquiry throughout the district. We are a member of the Network of Inquiry, Innovation and Indigenous Education, and through that we get financial support from this network, and we also match those grants financially to support the inquiry. So when we think about, as a professional inquiry, when we're mucking about or we're having these uncomfortable conversations around things like inclusion or diversity or privilege, our professional inquiry model or approach is there for professionals to try to figure these questions out, right? To go through a process where they're trying to find answers for themselves.
And a lot of these different things overlap. So an inquiry project often will involve a transitions period. So there's a group that did an inquiry question last year around transitions. There's another school that's pursuing that this year as well.
And we're supporting the creation of gender support plans for transitioning students. And as well, we have an alternative delivery of sensitive materials process in place for teachers and parents if parents do choose to have their children learn in a different manner around some of the sensitive topics that we address in our curriculum.
So there's a quick look at the system structures and people, some of the levers that they pull it within the system, and some examples of what it actually looks like as you pop in and out of schools. So now I'm going to ask you to imagine another time. And this time I want you to imagine a time in your life where you were most welcome. The sense of belonging was strongest. You felt acknowledged, you felt honored, you felt your unique needs were being celebrated. Where was that space? Who else might have been there? What was being said in that location? Where were you in that space? What did it sound like? What did it smell like? What did it feel like? For most of us, there's a big difference between that experience of feeling like you don't belong at all to that feeling like you really belong. This is your place. You're being acknowledged and celebrated and honored. And our goal in addressing these two lofty board goals is to help more of our students and families move from that sense of disconnectedness and lack of belonging and lack of connectedness and lack of honoring and lack of having their unique needs be addressed and acknowledged to one where everyone feels as they walk into our schools that sense of this is my space. People are taking care of me. And these two goals are the way to do it. So thank you for giving us the time to share out on that.
So I'm sure that we'll have a few questions for you. I know Trustee Higginson wanted to start off with part of that.
I have lots of questions. Thank you. I'm going to start with one that's indirect but related. I want to circle back to what we talked about the new curriculum having lots of opportunities for Indigenous ways of knowing. And unfortunately, when you do a scan of the new curriculum, it's actually only about 5% of the new curriculum that actually touches on Indigenous ways of knowing. And so, and particularly at the secondary level, it lacks a bit. And that's okay, because we're getting there. It's not a criticism, but what I'm making that statement because I think it's important for us not to rest on it yet. And so my question is about what NLPS can do about that. And I know, oh yeah, my mic, sorry, new system, thank you. I know that I know that's an important finesse they've been asking for many years, backed by the Trustees Association at our AGM, to have students have a required course for graduation that includes Indigenous content. And it's not an additional course in the requirements, it's that, a Halkamenim language course, First Peoples English. And so what I'm wondering is, does NLPS have the ability to have an additional graduation requirement outside of what is already in the provincial requirements? Does anyone know that? This is like a total flying
It's a good question.
out of nowhere question.
It's good to start with a zinger right off the bat.
Yeah, I just thought about it. So
We don't have the ability to have
I don't think
different-
we have the ability to set additional graduation requirements outside of outside of the ministry requirements.
But in a school, we have the ability to only offer English First People for a semester or, right, something like that.
Okay.
In addition, I would say that the curriculum, if you were to scan it with a word search and look for the word Aboriginal Indigenous, you might find a certain percentage that address that, but there are so many others that we can breathe with our knowledge, understanding, whether it's connection to the land through science, social studies, culture, all of those pieces, we can bring that in with absolutely no problem whatsoever, right?
And if we do a good enough job of providing those opportunities and changing the mindset so that people want to engage in that experience more and have those learnings happen, then our counselors and our course selections and our offerings will allow students to have multitudes of opportunities, as opposed to saying we have to require it. We'll have, 3, 4, 5 years from now, we might have a group of students graduating where we say, how many different opportunities did you have to have a course that was heavily focused on Indigenous ways of knowing, and have the majority of our students say 8, 10, 12 of my courses or all of my courses had a focus on that, right, as opposed to just one.
Imagine the time.
Imagine the
We
time.
also have the ability to have Halkamenim language as a second language,
Absolutely.
not French.
Yeah, that's been approved. So.
Trustee Trustee, thank you. Trustee Rizovich?
Thank you.
You had mentioned learning coordinators, and I know that there's been some changes to the way the learning coordinators are sort of functioning and working. I lost my.
You're on.
It was.
Yeah, you're up. You're on. No.
And I'm just wondering, have you thought of, is there anything you're doing to sort of evaluate how those changes are working, or if they're working, or?
Not formally. I
Okay.
think we're still pretty early in the year, but as you may recall when we discussed this with you last year, their titles have been changed, and we talked about broadening their portfolios to allow them to be flexible. That is occurring, but as well, folks that bring in their high levels of expertise in particular areas is also being honored,
Excellent.
as we said it would be.
Yeah, no, and I just wanted to put it out there again, because there's been questions from people.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
thanks.
Trustee Keller?
Thank you, through the chair. So this may be related to the RTI component of our opportunities here. I was wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit in relation to what we're doing with respect to violence in our schools and bullying.
It's an interesting.
Well, I think we have structures in place for reporting of those pieces on a more formal basis. We also have codes of conduct. We have all sorts of structures in schools that discuss and align and communicate and build capacity around expected behaviors, unexpected behaviors. All of those pieces are in place. The curriculum really emphasizes the core competencies, which address a lot of behavior and a lot of the way that we think and exist in the world. Are you looking for something a little bit more formal or specific?
Perhaps what supports we have or programs we have in place to support both students and parents.
I don't know that we have necessarily formal programs in place, but as I said, every school has a code of conduct and has, they're teaching children all of the time around these expected behaviors and addressing bullying or perceived bullying when it does happen, working with both parents and teachers. There are some parent education programs as well that address bullying.
Yeah. Yeah, we have our child youth family support workers also make that connection with families who might have some issues with that. So there's a connection there. There's an emphasis on just a shift in the last 5, 6, 7 years away from a punitive model to a much more restorative model. And I think schools are focusing on ways to bring kindness and just being a more caring community back into that thinking. So when students do have some dysregulation or some upset, there's a process for them, a layer of support to be able to say, how do I deal with upset? How do I deal with some animosity in my peer group, as opposed to just lashing out physically, and then the response from the school being just a disciplinary one and then move on. It's very much a what happened and how do you restore things and make things whole with that peer group again. So I think schools are working on it. There's definitely more work to be done because there's always challenges in the system this large.
I'm actually next on the list, and I don't think, I'm not sure if I need a mic to speak, but I'm sure you can hear me. I'm mic'd here. I'm going to follow up on Trustee Keller's comments, which is a kind of a long-standing question of mine with regards to the restorative approach, which I understand is our intention. I'm wondering what is it that we do when children don't have perspective taking? Or how, so first off, what do we do when they don't have perspective taking? Because without perspective taking, you can't really participate in a restorative process, because the intent is to have the perspective of the other, the harmed or the other side. So I'm wondering, what is it that we do for children that don't have perspective taking abilities? And as we know, perspective taking is also something that increases developmentally. So I'm wondering if you could enhance that conversation a bit about how is it, what are we doing to foster perspective taking abilities?
That's a good one. I don't know if we necessarily have like a 3-step model, but when you mention perspective taking and developmental appropriateness, reminded me of a Leighton Schnellert webinar series which is happening. So there's one last week, and then there's 2 more coming up, where he talked a lot about the neuroplasticity and the developing brain in the middle. He calls it the middle years, but the middle years not being the schooling, grade 6, 7, 8, or 7, 8, 9, but the middle years of kind of like grade 4, like age 9, right through to kind of grade 16, 17, how there's that developmental period where there's wiring and rewiring. And encouraging schools to talk about what's appropriate response for students and appropriate levels of support. So it can be challenging, because you can have a student who's 9 years old who has a very developed perspective taking, and you can have a student who's 16 who doesn't. And that's all of our students who have that challenge. So what do you do when a student is ready for that perspective taking? Then the restorative practice works really, really well, whether it's done at the school level, or we have the John Howard Society that comes in and does formal restorative practices for us. And when students don't, that restorative piece for that other person who was harmed doesn't take place, because this person's work is around that perspective taking and that developmental piece that's appropriate for them. And it doesn't always match up. 2 9-year-olds don't always have the same ability to be in the right space at the same time, and neither do 2 16-year-olds, right? It's a challenge.
And I think at every level, like starting in kindergarten with sharing and taking turns, and we're building skills around empathy and compassion very explicitly. And I just keep coming back to the core competencies and the structures that we have in our schools around 6-seaters, for example, and looking at characteristics that we want to support in our educated citizens. So that'll start in kindergarten, and every year, depending on the developmental appropriateness of that group of children, we look at all of those competencies and all of those characteristics, and we nurture them. And we often have school goals around those, and we often have, schools will scan. I just spoke with a school the other day where with the grade 7s, empathy seems to not exist, and they're really focusing on looking at how do we address this. And so they're launching into their inquiry model, and they're trying programs and they're trying approaches to address the data that's sitting right in front of them. And they'll all be, as you've mentioned, very developmentally appropriate, and it's been happening always at the kindergarten through grade 12, but with the core competencies, we're really held accountable to those.
Trustee Higginson's actually back on that list.
So this may, maybe I'm asking the same question that just got asked, but I feel like it's different. I'm trying to figure out because we have a lot of really great programs in place, and I see them, and I'm trying to figure out, what do we do to make sure that this gets all the way down to the people, to the students, right to the playground, right to our often the people who are supervisors, on the playground, they have that direct connection with those kids in those moments. So do we provide them with, proper, all of this type, all these wonderful things? I'm trying to see how what we're all talking here, what processes we have in place to make sure that it's getting all the way through the system to every single person who has contact with our children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think as we grow and as we make this more of a focus, we'll develop more structures and systems to be able to respond to your question. I think that we have, as you've mentioned, we've got many programs and pieces in place, but getting that assurance down to all level of all people, I think we're still in the process of that. I think we're recognizing and realizing and finding more ways to pull EAs together, for example, and have them supported and trained, and some professional learning around a particular aspect or characteristic that we might see arise in that particular school, which might be different from this school. Mm-hmm. But I think there are some absolutely core pieces that, regardless of the context of the school, we can absolutely, as a district, make sure these 3 fundamental things are getting to all levels. Absolutely.
Trustee Brezovich?
I just wanted to get a little bit more information, or get a bit of a refresher from my brain here on the alternate delivery for sensitive topics, and just how that works for parents, and how we do teachers provide support to the parents so that it's getting covered appropriately, in the depth that it needs to, and
yeah, and a good example is the sexual health component of the physical health education piece. Often parents will say, does my son or daughter have to participate in this piece? And the answer is yes, it's a mandated part of the curriculum. is there any other way they can do that? And that's where there's an alternative program. And so we have administrative procedures for that, and there's requirements for parents, and often parents are more than willing to do that piece. It just requires them to demonstrate how they're going to engage in that material, just so that the teachers know that it's not a I'm not doing this, right? It's that we're respecting the family's desire to say, I would rather do that ourselves, take on those learning responsibilities, rather than have that sensitive material be taught by a teacher in the school. So there's processes in place, and that's the most obvious place that we see that, is we have parents saying, I don't feel comfortable with this, with my son or daughter being in a classroom with a teacher delivering this material. Is there any other way to do it? And the answer is yes.
I've got me on the list next, and Trustee Higginson, so I'm going to look to the left side of the room that's been silent. So just checking in with you all there. Okay. Alrighty. So I will first acknowledge that when we look at this board goal, it's a mouthful, you know, and it's a concept, and it's there's so much in there that needs to be unpacked that they could be an entire strategic plan all of on its own unpacked. So I recognize that it's huge, and that it speaks to the importance of those pieces in there. We're so desperate to get all those things in there, and they kind of hang together. So let's do this. So I want to acknowledge. I mean, I recognize that this is a tough thing, but on the other hand, why I think that some of us, and I know for me personally, one of the things that was really important in this is that, you know, one of the most common things we hear from parents is, Trustee Keller brought up the violence that kids might experience in the schools, or as Trustee Higginson brought up, on the playground, and how is it that we're addressing those issues. I mean, I know that we have the restorative justice as an attempt to kind of increase empathy and understanding, but I want to, given that we have parents and like myself as well, you know, we have concerns about this, I want to take it back a step farther, and Assistant Superintendent Balcom, you mentioned regulation and self-regulation and dysregulation. So I really believe that at the core level, when we look at social-emotional learning, is fundamental to self-regulation, and then also perspective taking. You know, learning one's emotional reaction, learning one's experience, and how then do I control one's emotional reaction and one's experience allows you to kind of have that not only perspective taking for other but for self. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the efforts that we have. You know, I know it's in the curriculum, but oftentimes it's taken as a piece on its own, as an endeavor within school districts. They may take priorities and take, for example, Stan Kuchar's work or something along those lines. So could you help me understand what we're doing about the social emotional learning and in efforts to kind of increase that self-regulation piece as a preparatory work on the, you know, or more preventative work and for the later end?
That's right.
I can only speak in generalities at this point, I would say, and I think as we move throughout the board's presentations, I think I can bring you back more specifics and specific examples. But again, I'm going to talk about the core competencies, and both social and individual responsibility those are in there. Those are in our curriculum. Students are required to self-assess, and teachers are required to report on these. And so I think even just that shift brings it more into the purview, more at the forefront, to make sure we're really conscious of those things. And I'm certainly happy to bring back more specific examples of how that's happening in schools and in classrooms.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. So on page 13, when you listed out opportunities for influence, like that was a really interesting page, and I really liked all the information that was there. So I'm wondering if you could, particularly under the opportunities for influence, because those are the larger sort of program type educational opportunities that we provide. For our role as overseers and oversight of the system, can you you can either do like just have a broad statement on this or pick one. Like what sort of tools and measures do we know to know it's working, that this is moving the dial? And I mean, if we want to pick one, we could talk about the PLCs, because that's certainly one that we hear about a lot. So how do we know for our communities, like what do we do at the district level, to let us know that these opportunities for influence are being successful in moving the dial that we're looking for?
That's a great question. So with regards to PLC, if that's one you're identifying, this past year, we spent quite a bit of time coming together on this topic, delving in, looking at the data, tracking behaviors. I'm in the process right now of doing all of my school visits. I'm in every school with their student support team, with the principal, vice principal, and PLCs is always a topic that we have to discuss, and we talk about what the culture is, what they're achieving, what they literally do when they come together. So it's a bit more anecdotal, but I'm well aware as I'm going through my visits of every single school and what happens, what the topics are, how they group, what their inquiries are. How those inquiries support the overarching larger school goal. Also, during this past year when we had the PLC series, we facilitated surveys as well. And we had our inquiry and innovation teachers as well working with PLC time. As we had all of the data around what the topics were. And we look at the data, the student data, and we ask about the data and how the data connects to PLCs as well and try to draw those lines. So I have a whole bunch of anecdotal information for sure. But what I really try to impress when I visit schools is really looking at the student data and talking about how systems and structures that you have in your school, like a PLC, is supporting this, addressing the data and supporting your school goals. And so schools report out on that to me.
Alrighty. Any other questions from the room? Trustee Barron?
Yes, thank you through the chair. Question around process. Oh, thank you, Trustee Wilkinson. Just a question around process before we send staff on their way after this great presentation that you've just brought to us. Thank you. Us as a board, when we are requesting information as individual trustees, what is our process for us deciding if we have a majority that would like that information? I just want to make sure that we are cognizant of when we're asking staff for information, that it's not information from one trustee, that it is a majority of the board who would like that information. So I was hoping that we could decide A, what was being asked for information, and B, if the majority of the board actually is requesting that information before we send staff off to start pulling together that information.
I wasn't aware that anybody had directed any reports or
Okay.
any requests for any information specifically. Was there something else that
Okay.
you were aware of?
I wanted to make sure that we weren't sending staff off to put together a report or presentation for the board without ensuring that the majority of the board was.
I don't think I heard that tonight. Did somebody?
Okay. There was a conversation with you wanting some, through the chair to the chair, some information. And so I just wanted to clarify if you were requesting information from staff, and if so, if we can ensure that the majority of the board is requiring that information.
I asked a question here publicly, but I did not make a request for a report. I think we have other processes for that.
Good. So just to clarify, we're not asking staff to put together a presentation or report then?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Alrighty. Any other comments? Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, as far as I know, we have no correspondence that were referred from the regular board meeting. And I know of no unfinished business or new business. Ms. Matthews, was there a question tonight? Ms. Steele didn't pepper us full of questions? Okay. Alrighty, then I will seek a motion to adjourn. Trustee O'Neill? We need a seconder on this if you'd like to leave. Trustee Higginson, thank you very much. All those in favor? Okay, I got 3 of us and 4. Thank you, and we are adjourned.